Hey everyone, I'm Shane Snipes, and you're watching Sustainable 1000. Thanks so much for continuing to follow my journey around the country as I do 1,000 interviews across 48 states in what I hoped was 250 days. And I am coming up on that 250-day mark as I approach Florida now. But I'm currently in South Carolina, one of the places that I've lived. I used to live in Charleston, and we're just south of Charleston right now at this great facility called Kaw, and it's a park area, a natural park area that has tons of material about the history that's part of the southern culture, as well as sort of what's happened in the culture with farming and how things used to be grown here. And I'm really excited to have as my guest today one of the folks who's known a lot about the history of the area from a studied and from a scholarly perspective, with a history degree and having that background, as well as having taught some middle school or high school. Which was it?
High school, Shane. Yeah, I taught high school for 5 years. And if you can see, the trimmer's about gone now. So it's been about 7 years since I left the classroom.
Yeah, it was a shock, right? Being there.
It was. It was kind of a good shock, and it was kind of a relief of a shock to eventually escape from that.
Sure. Well, tell me a little bit about some of the things what brought you into this area of history, specifically in relationship to Kaka. But first, let's talk about South Carolina and your understanding of South Carolina history. Where'd it come from?
Well, I did grow up in South Carolina, in Columbia, and I went to the University of South Carolina. I had about 6 different majors, but ultimately I realized I had enough history credits to go ahead and finish that program. And so I was always very curious about South Carolina and the Southeast and American history, and particularly the African American experience. And so I spent a lot of time researching that, and since this site is really a place to investigate the African American experience, it was a really good fit for me.
Talk a little bit about that. What's so special from an African American history perspective about Kaka?
Well, when I studied history, I was really interested in indigenous cultures, and it wasn't until I'd been pursuing that for a short while I realized that's anthropology. And, so what was wide open, or not wide open, but nearly, was the African American studies, because it had been mostly ignored up until recent times, and so there was a lot of interesting research to do. And also from a social justice standpoint, a story that needed to be told and shared with people, and we live in a time now where you can share that story.
Yeah, absolutely. Give me some specifics, because I know I have a bunch of questions from historians who are friends of mine, who sent me things online. I appreciate all those questions, by the way, guys. Keep those coming. But I appreciated some of the questions about the Kaka and the history of growing food in the South and how it's transitioned and changed. And this, I think, will be a nice way for us to transition into this concept of sustainability. But talk a little bit about the history of food in this area.
Okay, great. Of course, prehistory immediately comes to mind, and that seems to be the last time we were genuinely sustainable in this area as humans. Populations were kept low as part of a cultural tradition. Farming was casual. It was extra. The resources here were very bountiful, and so, of course, it wasn't commercial. It was just for sustenance, and in a place that's prone to hurricanes and occasional droughts, maybe not something on a small scale that you can depend on. And so it was, farming was a very important part, at least for the last 1,000 years, we believe, around here. But more as kind of a gardening, 2 or 3 crops of corn and some squashes, pumpkins, some beans. But most of the sustenance was taken from nature. Would have been a fantastic place to live in prehistoric times because of all the seafood resources and the climate and the forests here. Once Europeans and Africans showed up, immediately they began to transform the land. There was no cultural tradition of population control, and so really people had as many children as they could. There were more help. And of course, with enslaved people, the more children were born, the more enslaved people to do the work. So very quickly, things like food became a commodity and not just a given. And of course, we've come a long way since then, but we've been following that same pattern ever since, with crops that can be produced in a single year rather than things that might take a little bit longer and have more of a perennial status. So the big story here with the farming, Shane, is it completely transformed the landscape. Ancient swamps were removed to grow rice, and wherever there was fresh water in this region, they grew rice in it. So some of these swamps, probably all of these swamps, were here since at least the last climate change, thousands of years. We really don't have much to look at today to try to imagine what they'd have been like, but it was a huge landscape transformation, and certainly Native Americans transformed the landscape as well, but not to any type of degree like this. So ultimately what's happened is really interesting. Once the rice era was over and these rice fields abandoned, they succeeded some back into Cypress Tupelo Swamp. Others, where the rice banks were breached by storms and erosion, became tidal salt marsh. Many of the former rice fields were managed for things like duck hunting, and so a brackish habitat was desirable. So today, where there was once an ancient swamp that was transformed into rice fields, we have tidal salt marsh, brackish marsh, fresh marsh, Cypress Tupelo Swamp, as well as some isolated gum ponds kind of around the area. That's a lot of different wetland habitats. And so what's, I think, unique about this site is it's not just an incredibly diverse wildlife sanctuary. It's an incredibly diverse wildlife sanctuary largely because of what humans did to the environment, which is not something we usually think of as being a positive. So it's not just an interesting, significant historic site. It's a very diverse natural site, and those things can't be separated. They go together.
Where did the name Caw Caw come from? I'm interested to know.
Well, Caw Caw is the park itself is named for Caw Caw Swamp, and we're surrounded by Caw Caw Swamp. The name seems to predate European and African settlement, so likely a Native American term. There's some other Caw Caws around the southeast that are all associated with water, so we probably think it has something to do with that. Of course, there's local stories about Caw Caw the Indian boy, or the sound a fish crow makes, and fish crows are pretty common in a swamp. They say caw caw. So we'll never get a firm answer on that, but since it predates Europeans and Africans, likely a Native American term.
Sure. In terms of Caw Caw and kind of its place in the park system here in South Carolina, what stands out in the Charleston area about this site compared to some of the others? Because I'm sure you're familiar with a lot of them. You worked at the organization now in the Park Services for quite a few years, and that's a nice experience to have. But tell me some of the things that you've seen that stand out for this particular site.
I think the most significant thing about the site is the diversity. There are over 400 species of vascular plants that have been identified in the park. We've got 254 different species of birds that have been seen in the park. And the park's about 1 square mile, so it's not a giant place. To have that kind of diversity is incredible. We have in this site almost every landscape, every habitat, every ecosystem that you would find in the coastal plain, perhaps with the exception of the beach and Barrier Island ecosystems, and things like Carolina Bays, isolated wetlands that are unique for that reason. So not just for residents of Charleston County, but for visitors, this site is kind of a great snapshot of the region.
Definitely. I want to get one of these questions in because it popped into my mind when you were talking of one of the ones I had seen as you guys were sending me questions earlier. I appreciate that. One of the things that they asked was, in terms of sustainability, what are some of the reasons sustainability should matter to a place like Caw Caw, where you've worked where this has been worked on before, and wait 1 second. I was reading the other question and I didn't see that. Um, Guys, you guys sent me questions, but they weren't very clear. Shame on you.
Rambling question.
It is.
I can answer rambling questions with a rambling answer.
Absolutely. All right, so the question for you is, looking at the history of Kaka and African American history, does it seem that there's specific African American traits that are included in the Interpretive Center's education tools?
Ooh, yeah, I like that question. There absolutely are. Everywhere you go in this park, you'll see evidence of human activity, and the vast majority of that is the legacy of enslaved people carving these rice fields out of the ancient swamps in the form of ditches and banks, drains, rice trunks, and water control structures. And it's funny, pieces of rice trunks are everywhere. They were made from cypress, which doesn't decay at any kind of appreciable rate. And so there's artifacts just scattered throughout the rice growing regions of the low country. We kind of have to ride the fence between our natural resource management and our cultural resource management. For instance, one of the recommendations to encourage diversity in vegetation is to have occasional fires, controlled, prescribed fires that burn through certain habitats that would have occurred naturally, but were suppressed for at least the 20th century. And in the process of following this natural resource management plan, we inadvertently are burning up some of our cultural history. All those cypress things I mentioned, pieces of former rice trunks and bulkheads and piers and docks and things that are still there can burn. So there's that. There's also an issue of a lot of these former rice fields are still intact, but they are in the succession process. They are working their way back towards being swamps again. Do we keep them the way that they are so that people can maybe more easily appreciate the vast scope of the African American legacy on this land? Or do we let them turn back into swamps, which they would naturally do, and enjoy the investigation of the natural succession of landscapes? Or somewhere in the middle, do we do both? And that's more of a preservation than a sustainability agenda. But I think they go hand in hand. What we'd like to do is make sure that there's still good habitat, and not just pockets of good habitat that we have, but corridors of habitat. And where there's not, if we can enhance what nature does, we may be mitigating some of these broken up areas where the habitat's not connected. For instance, by providing wood duck boxes and bluebird boxes, other types of bird nesting habitat, we're probably in improving their chances of survival and their population numbers where critical habitat's being lost elsewhere. So, a lot of times people say, well, you don't need to tamper with nature. That's nature, and it's supposed to do what it does. And another way of looking at that is humans have dramatically changed things already. What we may need to do is the best job we can at maintaining what still exists and enhancing some of those areas to make up for what doesn't exist anymore.
Sure. That and natural systems come back if we leave them alone, right? Because there's a natural ecosystem and a sustainability aspect to that, which I sort of drive home a lot when I have conversations and give presentations. This idea that ecosystems work, and that when we step away from that, there's a lot more opportunity for those to work more effectively. Now, that doesn't always happen, of course, right? Because we have our own desires and our own things that we have to get done, whether it's business or development or economics. Humans have their desires, right? And that's direct play there. Working in a park system like we do here, how do you see sustainability, the concept, the idea of it, working into something like what happens here inside of Kaw.
Well, Shane, the best answer I have for that is our rigorous natural resource management plan. And of course, that ties in great with what you're saying. Natural resource management has no need to exist without humans. It's more of a social studies concept than a science concept. Natural resource management is a response to humans, because without humans, there's no need for it. It's said a couple of ways, but it kind of hits home the point. So what we can do, the best we can do, is try to make sure we're providing the best habitat possible so that the ecosystems can work as well as possible in light of the fact that the landscape has already been completely changed. If we had pristine wilderness here, and we don't in the southeast very much at all, it'd be a different story. It'd be completely hands-off, or close to it. But we don't. And so I think mitigation is a good word for a lot of what we do. There's no need for us to provide good habitat. For instance, we keep the water levels in the former rice fields here deep in the winter to encourage migrating waterfowl. And when I say encourage, I mean provide good habitat, places where they'd like to stop over. In the spring and summer, we keep the water levels very low, and that provides great habitat for things like wading birds and shorebirds that like the sheets of water where they can pick the little invertebrates and fish and things out. What we're doing is mimicking natural systems. Here, the wetlands are impounded. They were banked to grow rice, and so it's not a natural setting. It's disconnected from the rest of it. And if we can replicate some of what should happen naturally, seasonally, and beyond that, then we're probably doing the best we can sustainably to, as far as sustainability goes, to make sure that this is here for the future.
It's been a pleasure chatting, learning about Kaw, and it's so nice to chat with you about it. We'll take a quick break, and we'll be right back with another segment in just a moment. I'm Shane Snipes, and you're watching Sustainable 1000. And if folks want to find out about Kaw, what's the website where they can do that?
The website is www.ccprc.com. That's Charleston County Park and Recreation Commission.
Thanks, guys. Cool. So we'll take